The day Henrietta Callahan was led into Barker's trading post by a rope tied around her wrists was the day she decided that if no man in this territory was going to help her, she would help herself, and she nearly succeeded. The year was 1874, and the trading post sat at the edge of Laramie County in Wyoming Territory, a squat, weather-beaten building that smelled of tobacco, dried meat, and the particular desperation that accumulated in frontier places where the law was more suggestion than substance. The late October wind had teeth that morning, driving grit through every crack in the warped pine walls, and the few men gathered inside had pulled their collars up and their hats down, making themselves smaller against the cold and against the thing happening in their midst, a thing that none of them seemed inclined to stop. Henrietta was 22 years old, with hair the color of dark autumn leaves and eyes that were a complicated green, the kind of green that shifted depending on her mood, which today was pure fury. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself as though she occupied considerably more space than her frame suggested, and even with her wrists bound and her dress torn at one shoulder from where she had fought her captor in the street outside, she looked less like a woman defeated and more like a woman calculating. The man who had her rope was named Cecil Drummond, and he was the kind of man the frontier had a surplus of in that era, a drifter with a lean, hungry look, old enough to know better than his habits suggested, and mean in the specific way that comes from having never been held accountable for anything. He was 41 years old, broad through the shoulders, and he had found Henrietta 3 days ago on the road north of Cheyenne, where her wagon had broken an axle and left her stranded with everything she owned and no one to hear her scream. "I'm telling you right now, Cecil Drummond," Henrietta said, her voice low and controlled in a way that cost her considerable effort, "that whatever you think you are doing, you are going to regret it at a depth you cannot presently imagine." "Hush now," Drummond said, not even looking at her, scanning the room instead with the practiced ease of a man looking for buyers. There were perhaps a dozen people in Barker's trading post that morning. Old Silas Barker himself stood behind his plank counter with the expression of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything and had long since stopped trying to prevent it. 2 women, a rancher's wife and her daughter who had come for flour and salt, stood very still near the door, not looking at Henrietta, which was its own kind of wound. 3 cowboys sat at a rough table playing cards with the concentration of men determined to be somewhere else in their minds. A fur trapper had fallen asleep against the far wall with his hat over his face. And scattered among the shelves of dry goods and hardware and ammunition were another 4 or 5 men whose purposes were not immediately apparent. Drummond raised his voice to the room. "I have here a woman, healthy, good teeth, no children, educated enough to be useful. Name is Henrietta Callahan, late of St. Louis, Missouri. Father's dead, no brothers, no husband. She was heading to a teaching position in Casper that I suspect she won't be needing anymore." He said this last part with a smile that made the room go very quiet. "I'm looking for a reasonable arrangement." Henrietta's hands moved behind her back in small, precise motions. She had been working at the knot in the rope for the better part of an hour, finding the angles with her fingers, and she was close, very close, but close was not finished. The first man who stepped forward was Abe Strickland, a cattle rancher from the Platte River country, a man in his early 50s with silver-streaked hair and a paunch that spoke to prosperity. He walked around Henrietta with the kind of slow, assessing look that made her stomach turn, though she kept her expression level and her eyes forward. "What are you asking?" Strickland said. $40 and a horse," Drummond said. Strickland stroked his chin. "She looks like she'd be trouble." "She'll settle," Drummond said, and the casualness of the words, the absolute confidence in them, made Henrietta's throat tighten with something that was partly rage and partly terror, and she permitted herself to feel both for exactly 3 seconds before she put them aside and focused on the rope. The second man was younger, perhaps 30, a lean, angular fellow named Prescott who ran a small freight operation out of Fort Laramie. He had a sharp, intelligent face that Henrietta found almost more unsettling than Strickland's blunt assessment, because intelligent men sometimes convinced themselves that what they were doing made sense. "I could use someone at the way station," Prescott said. "Cooking, cleaning, I'll treat her fair." "You'll treat her fair," Drummond repeated, as though this were a charming thing to say. The third man was a gambler named Holt, and he did not step forward so much as drift forward, the way smoke moves in a still room. He was somewhere between 35 and 50, with hands like a surgeon and eyes that had seen every kind of game. He looked at Henrietta the way he would look at a hand of cards, calculating the odds, weighing the risk against the reward. "She speaks well," Holt said, more to himself than anyone. "She does," Drummond agreed. "I'll give you 25 and a bottle of whiskey." 40 and a horse, Drummond said, not moving. It was during this negotiation, Strickland coming back in with a counteroffer, Prescott shifting his weight and arguing about condition and circumstances, Holt maintaining his cool remove while placing his numbers on the invisible table between them, that Henrietta felt the rope give. Not entirely, just enough, just the one loop she needed. She stood very still, keeping her hands positioned to look bound, and she let her eyes move carefully across the room. The women by the door were still not looking at her. Old Silas Barker was examining the surface of his counter. The card players had put down their cards and were watching the proceedings with the dispassionate interest of men who would later tell this story in saloons and feel nothing about their own inaction. And then there was the man near the back of the room. He had come in perhaps 10 minutes ago, while Drummond was doing his preliminary assessment of the room, and he had not drawn attention to himself in any way. He was perhaps 28 or 29, not particularly remarkable in height or breadth, wearing a canvas duster the color of river mud, and a hat that had taken considerable weather in its time. He had a rifle slung on his back and a revolver on his hip, both of which described the average man in this territory. He had moved to the back of the store and appeared to be examining a display of harness rings with genuine interest. But Henrietta had been watching people her whole life, really watching, the way you learn to do when you are a woman who has understood from a young age that attention to detail is a form of protection, and she had noticed certain things about this man. He had positioned himself so that he could see both the front door and the room in his peripheral vision. His posture was easy but not relaxed, the particular stillness of someone holding themselves ready. And twice in the last 10 minutes, so briefly that she almost doubted it, he had looked at her with an expression that was not the blank assessment of the buyers or the avoidant discomfort of the witnesses, but something else entirely. Something that looked very much like anger on her behalf. This observation did not make Henrietta feel safer, because she had learned not to trade one man's intentions for another man's without evidence. But it was a data point, and she stored it away while the argument over her price continued. "I'm not going below 35, Drummond was saying. Henrietta slipped the rope off her wrists. She kept her hands behind her back for 4 more seconds, took a slow breath, and then she walked toward the front door. She made it exactly 4 steps before Drummond's hand caught her arm. The room went still. "Now, Henrietta," Drummond said, and his voice had dropped to the soft register that she had come to understand was more dangerous than when he shouted, "You know there's nowhere to run to out there. It's 7 miles to the nearest homestead and the wind is picking up." "Let go of my arm," she said. "I'm afraid I can't do that." "I am afraid," she said clearly, "that you have made a very significant error in your understanding of what I will and will not accept." "What you will accept," he said, and his grip tightened, "is going to be decided by one of these gentlemen in the next 5 minutes. It was at this moment that the man from the back of the room spoke. His voice was measured, unhurried, and carried the particular quality of a man who does not raise it often and therefore does not need to. "Release her arm." Drummond turned his head slowly, and the room turned with him, in the way that rooms do when something that has been building finally arrives at its moment. The man had not moved from the back of the store. He was still standing among the harness rings, but his right hand had dropped to his side with a casualness that was not casual at all. "This isn't your business, friend," Drummond said. "Releasing her arm will make it not my business," the man said. "What happens after that is between her and the open road." "I have money in this woman," Drummond said, using the words with the particular ugliness they deserved. "You have a rope that she already got herself out of," the man said, and Henrietta saw the flicker of genuine surprise cross Drummond's face as he looked down and registered the rope hanging loose at his belt. "So it seems to me what you have is significantly less than you think you have, and I would suggest taking stock of that before you make any further decisions." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either catastrophe or sense. Henrietta could feel the room holding its breath, the card players gone absolutely still, old Silas Barker leaning forward on his counter with his hands flat on the wood. Then Abe Strickland cleared his throat. "Now, I don't think anyone needs to get excited here." Drummond let the woman alone for a moment. Drummond looked at Strickland. He looked at the man at the back of the room. He looked at the rope hanging empty at his belt. And in the mathematics of that moment, the cost of a confrontation against the loss of $40 and a horse, something shifted in his face. He released Henrietta's arm. She did not run. She stepped back 2 paces, which put her equidistant from Drummond and the door, and she looked directly at the man at the back of the room. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. "We're not outside." He walked forward from the back of the store, and as he passed through the light that came in low and gray through the dirty windows, she saw him more clearly. His face was angular but not harsh, weathered in the particular way of a man who spends his days outdoors, with a jaw that carried 3 days of dark stubble and eyes that were a very steady, very dark shade of brown. He was not a handsome man in the way that seemed designed to announce itself, but he was a face you wanted to look at a second time, and a third. He stopped between her and Drummond. "The lady is not a commodity," he said to the room at large, with a quietness that somehow filled the space entirely. "She is a person, and she has made it clear she would like to leave. Anyone who has a disagreement with that is welcome to bring it to me directly." Nobody had a disagreement, it turned out. Drummond looked at his empty rope. Strickland straightened his hat and found somewhere else to be interested. Prescott moved back toward the shelves. Holt, the gambler, watched the whole proceeding with his arms folded and a smile at the corner of his mouth that was genuinely appreciative, the smile of a man who has just seen a masterful hand played. The man in the canvas duster walked to the door, opened it against the wind, and held it without looking back. Henrietta Callahan pulled her torn shoulder straight, lifted her chin, and walked through it. The cold hit her like a wall, which after the past hour was an almost physical relief. She walked 6 steps from the door and stopped, facing the wind, breathing it in, letting it strip away the smell of that room. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and waited for them to stop. The door opened and closed behind her. She heard boots on the wooden steps. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Not in any permanent way," she said. He came around to stand in front of her, not too close, respecting the particular radius of space that she needed in that moment. She looked at him directly, which was something she did on principle, preferring to know a person's face. "My name is Frederick Covington," he said. "I have a horse and a supply of common sense, and I am heading north toward Casper if that is any use to you." She studied him for a moment. "Henrietta Callahan," she said. "I was heading to Casper as well. I had a teaching position before that man interfered with it." "Then it seems we're going the same direction," Frederick said. "Why did you help me?" She asked because she needed to know, because she was not going to step from one man's agenda into another man's without some understanding of what that agenda was. He seemed to take the question seriously, which she appreciated. He looked at the ground for a moment and then back at her. "Because what was happening in there was wrong," he said. "And because I have a mother and 2 sisters, and I have spent my life understanding what it means to be a person that other people think they can make arrangements about. And because you got yourself out of that rope on your own, and that deserved to count for something." Henrietta was quiet for a moment, listening to the wind, looking at this man whose face was honest in a way that was becoming harder to find with every mile west of the Mississippi. "I have no money," she said. "Drummond took everything I had, and I have no horse." "I have enough for both of us as far as Casper," Frederick said. "And my horse is steady enough to carry double if it comes to that." "You are a stranger to me," she said. "I am," he agreed. "I will need to understand considerably more about you before I am comfortable with that arrangement." "That seems entirely reasonable," he said, and the gravity of his tone made her think that he meant it, and the fact that he meant it made something ease very slightly in her chest. "Then we had better start walking," she said, "because I would like to put a great deal of distance between myself and that building." They walked. The road north out of the trading post was a rutted track that wound through short grass prairie, stretching to the horizon in shades of pale gold and brown, the kind of landscape that could make a person feel very exposed or very free depending on what they were leaving behind. A stand of cottonwoods along a frozen creek offered the only break in the flatness, and beyond it the land began to roll upward toward the distant suggestion of mountains wearing their first winter snow. Frederick's horse, a solid bay gelding named Garrison, was tied to the post outside the trading post and took to the road with the uncomplaining steadiness of a well-kept animal. Henrietta rode because Frederick insisted upon it, claiming that he had been sitting in the saddle for 2 days, and his legs were grateful for the exercise. She suspected this was not entirely truthful, but accepted it with a grace she hoped communicated both her gratitude and her awareness of the gesture. They talked as they went, because the silence of those plains was vast and talk was a reasonable way to fill it, and because Henrietta had indeed meant what she said about needing to understand more about him. Frederick Covington was, it emerged, 29 years old, originally from a farm in Indiana that had gone to drought and bad years when he was 17, which had sent him west in the way that the frontier sent for men with nothing left to anchor them. He had spent 3 years in Kansas cattle country, 2 years with a survey crew mapping sections of the Nebraska Territory, and the last 4 years in Wyoming, where he had built up a small ranch 40 miles northwest of Casper along a creek that ran cold and clear even in summer. "What do you raise?" Henrietta asked. "Horses, mostly. Some cattle. Enough to keep myself honest and have a little left over." He paused. "I go into Casper for supplies twice a year, and once for the horse auction in spring. It is not a large operation." "Are you alone out there?" "I have a hired man named Eli who has been with me 3 years. He is approximately 70 years old and denies it loudly." He said this with a quality in his voice that she was beginning to recognize as the specific warmth he reserved for people he was genuinely fond of. "And I have 11 horses at present, 2 of which are in a significant disagreement about the nature of personal space." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came out fully and without ceremony, the way a laugh does when something is actually funny and your guard is down just enough to let it through. She felt Frederick glance at her. "You have a nice laugh," he said, and then seemed to weigh the words against some internal standard and add, "I say that as observation, not imposition." "You are a careful man with your words," she said. "I try to be," he said. "I have found that most trouble starts with words that weren't given enough thought." She considered this. "Cecil Drummond gave his words considerable thought," she said. "He was very deliberate about all of it." "Drummond is a coward," Frederick said, and the simplicity and certainty of this was like a door closing on a room she did not want to keep entering. Cowards think about their words very carefully because they are always thinking about what they can take and how to dress it up as something else. That is not wisdom. That is calculation in the service of meanness. She was quiet for a moment. 3 days, she said. He had me for 3 days before the trading post. "I know," he said, and his voice went very quiet and very careful. "I saw the state of the rope on your wrists, old marks, not fresh." He didn't, she started, and then chose different words. He was waiting to make the most profitable arrangement. That was his version of restraint. "I'm sorry that happened to you," Frederick said. The directness of it, without embellishment or the fumbling awkwardness most men brought to such moments, made her eyes sting in a way she had not expected and did not particularly want. She looked at the horizon and breathed slowly. "I had almost gotten out of that rope by myself," she said, because it was important that he know this, that she had not been simply waiting to be rescued. "I know," he said. "I told Drummond as much. And if you hadn't spoken up when you did, I think you would have walked out of that door before another 2 minutes passed," he said. "I just removed the man between you and the door." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, from the elevation of Garrison's back, and he looked up at her without flinching or looking away, steady and serious, and without the particular quality that men often had when they wanted something, that faint shine of expectation, the lean of a man counting on gratitude to convert into something he could use. Frederick Covington simply looked at her the way you look at a person you are trying to understand, honestly and with full attention. "Frederick Covington," she said, "you are either a genuinely good man or the best imitation of one I have ever encountered." "I suppose the road to Casper is long enough to determine which," he said. It was 3 days' ride to Casper from where they were, along roads that were not truly roads, and through country that the autumn had stripped to its bones. They made camp that first night in the lee of a sandstone outcropping that broke the wind, and Frederick built a fire with an efficiency that spoke to long practice, and they ate dried beans and salt pork from his saddlebags and drank coffee that tasted like the best thing Henrietta had ever put in her mouth, which was partly because of how cold the night was, and partly because she had not had coffee in 3 days. She told him about herself by degrees, the way you do when you are learning to trust someone and are not yet sure how far that trust extends. Her father had been a school teacher in St. Louis, and he had taught her the same as he would have taught a son, which in 1874 was still sufficiently unusual to be worth noting. He had died of pneumonia 2 winters ago, and her mother had been gone since Henrietta was 9, which left her the particular independence of a person with no one to answer to and no one to catch them if they fell. The teaching position in Casper had come through a territorial education office, and she had taken it without hesitation because it was honest work, because she loved teaching with the same quiet passion that some people love music or the land, and because St. Louis without her father in it had lost whatever had held her there. "Did you have anyone in St. Louis?" Frederick asked. "Beyond your father?" "I had friends," she said. "A woman named Margaret who taught at the same school, and her husband who was decent to both of us, and I was courted for a time by a man named Daniel Hartley." "What happened?" "He married a banker's daughter," she said simply. "She had money and I had books, and he was not a man who found that a difficult calculation." Frederick was quiet for a moment. "His loss," he said, and it was so matter-of-fact, so completely without the excessive gallantry that might have made it hollow, that she felt it land honestly. "Perhaps," she said, "though it did not feel that way at the time." "Things rarely do," he said, and poked the fire with a stick, sending a cascade of sparks up into the black sky, and they both watched them go out one by one. The second day was harder riding, through country that climbed and dipped through draws and low hills, the wind picking up in the afternoon and carrying with it the first smell of real winter, not just autumn cold but the deep, bone-certain cold that Wyoming winter brought down from the mountains like a hand laid on the land. Frederick gave Henrietta his coat, which she refused twice before accepting, because the refusal was pride and the cold was actual. She rode and he walked for portions of the day, and then she walked and he rode, and they fell into a rhythm that felt, by the second afternoon, less like a temporary arrangement and more like something practiced. He was easy to talk to in a way that was not about charm. Charm was a tool and she had learned to identify it, but about a genuine interest in what she was saying and a willingness to say what he actually thought rather than what he calculated she wanted to hear. "Do you get lonely?" she asked him, somewhere in the middle of the afternoon. "Out at your ranch?" He thought about it. Sometimes, he said, Eli is good company and the horses are better than most people if I'm honest. But yes, there are evenings when the whole territory seems to settle into silence and the house feels very large for one person. What do you do on those evenings? I read, he said, which surprised her. I have a fair collection, mostly history and some natural philosophy. My mother sent me her Bible when I left Indiana and I have read it through 3 times, which surprised me because I did not think I was a man who read Bibles. What surprised you about it? The people, he said. They are all a great deal more complicated and more foolish than I expected. I found that comforting. She laughed again, and this time it was warm and long, and when she looked at him he was smiling, and it was the first time she had seen him fully smile, not the small, contained expressions of the day before, but an actual smile that changed his whole face and made him look younger and easier and entirely himself. You, she said, are a surprising man. I'm fairly ordinary, he said. Ordinary men, she said, do not walk into trading posts and face down the room on behalf of women they have never met. Ordinary men ought to, he said, and the lightness went out of his voice for a moment, replaced by something darker and more serious. What happened in that trading post happens a great deal in this territory, Henrietta, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. There are more Cecil Drummonds out here than I care to count, and there are more rooms full of men who watch and say nothing. The fact that I spoke up is not exceptional. It is the minimum required of a person. She looked at the road ahead of them. You are harder on yourself than the evidence requires, she said. Or the territory is easier on men who do nothing than it ought to be, he said. They made camp the second night beside the frozen creek, and the temperature dropped so sharply after dark that they kept the fire going high and sat close to it. Close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him an arm's length away, a warmth that was distinct from the fires. He told her about the ranch, the names of the horses, the way the creek looked in spring when it ran high and clear, the way the light came through the mountains in the early mornings in summer, turning everything gold and blue. He told it without trying to sell it to her, just describing it the way you describe a thing you love, and she listened with her eyes on the fire and felt something in her chest responding to it the way a compass responds to north. It sounds beautiful, she said. It is, he said. I would like for you to see it someday if you wished to. The words were careful and entirely without pressure, offered and left there, and she looked at the fire for a moment and said, I think I might like that. They were both quiet after that, and the quiet was not the silence of 2 strangers, but the silence of 2 people who have said something true and are allowing it to settle. On the 3rd morning, they came into Casper in the thin, bright light of a November morning, the little frontier town sitting in the Platte River Valley with its scattering of wooden buildings and its smell of horses and wood smoke and human enterprise. It was not much of a town by St. Louis standards, but Henrietta had not come here for the town, and she found that she looked at it with a warmth she had not expected, which she suspected had something to do with the company she had kept for the last 3 days. They went first to the territorial school office, which occupied a single room above the land recorder's office and was presided over by a harassed-looking man named Hopkins who had paperwork in every direction and ink on both hands. Henrietta explained her situation to him in direct, clear terms, omitting nothing material. Hopkins listened with an expression of increasing discomfort. The teaching position is still available, he said finally. We were wondering what had happened to you, Miss Callahan. We thought perhaps you had changed your mind. I had not changed my mind, she said. I encountered an obstacle. Yes, well, he shuffled papers. The school board will want to meet you naturally, and you'll need lodging. We have an arrangement with a Mrs. Patterson on Spruce Street who takes in boarders of a respectable character. That will do well, she said. Hopkins looked at Frederick, who had been standing near the door with his hat in his hands, with the slightly suspicious look that frontier officialdom directed at anyone who showed up with a woman who had a story attached to her. And this gentleman, Henrietta said, is Frederick Covington, a rancher in this county, who was kind enough to see me safely to town when my original means of transport were unavailable. He is a man of good character, and you may write that down if you like." Hopkins blinked at the precision of this endorsement and wrote nothing down. Frederick, outside on the street afterward, put his hat back on and looked at her with an expression that contained what might have been the beginning of something if it were given any encouragement. "You will be all right here," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I will," she said. "I am very good at being all right." "I know," he said. And then, more carefully, "My ranch is 40 miles northwest. Eli knows where everything is if someone asks for it. I come into Casper for supplies near the end of November and again before Christmas." She looked at him. He was backlit by the thin November sun, the collar of his coat up against the cold, and she registered with the particular clarity of a moment she suspected she would remember for a long time that she was not ready for him to leave, which was a feeling she had not had in a considerable while, and which she trusted about as much as she trusted anything, carefully, with full attention, and with the understanding that careful trust is still trust. "I will look for you in November," she said. He smiled, that full, transforming smile. "I will be easy to find," he said. "I am usually at Harlan's Feed and Supply arguing with the price of oats." She laughed, and he tipped his hat, and then he rode away up the main street of Casper on his steady bay horse, and she watched him go, and the cold came in where his warmth had been, and she stood in it for a moment and let herself feel it before she turned and walked toward Mrs. Patterson's boarding house on Spruce Street. The school in Casper was a single room with 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, housed in a building that was better than it had any right to be, thanks to what appeared to have been a period of civic enthusiasm that had since somewhat waned. The stove worked, the windows were mostly sound, and the shelves held a respectable collection of primers, a Webster's dictionary, and 3 volumes of a natural history encyclopedia that were missing their second volume, which remained a source of some frustration. Henrietta threw herself into teaching with the full force of who she was. She was good at it. She had known this about herself since she was 18 and had helped her father with his youngest students. And the children of Casper took to her with the quick, shrewd affection of children who can tell when an adult is genuinely interested in them. She had a red-haired boy named Tommy Griffith, who was a mathematical genius trapped in a curriculum that had not yet reached him, and she spent extra time each morning advancing him beyond the standard material. She had 2 Shoshone children, a brother and sister named Amos and Clara, whose presence in the school was considered controversial by some of the town's more settled settlers, and whose intelligence and determination she found quietly humbling. She had a girl named Vera who could not read at 12 and who had been told, at various points in her life, that she was slow, and who turned out to have an eyesight problem that meant she could not see the letters clearly. Henrietta fashioned her a seat directly at the front and read aloud with her every day and watched her bloom. She also, in the interstices of this work, thought about Frederick Covington. She thought about him in the evenings at Mrs. Patterson's, which was a warm, slightly chaotic house that smelled of yeast bread and had a cat named Admiral who sat on whatever you were reading. She thought about the way he had looked at her across that room in Barker's Trading Post, not with the calculation of Strickland or the cold assessment of Holt or Prescott's fumbling self-justification, but with something clean and direct and genuinely angry on her behalf. She thought about the campfire conversations, the way he talked about his horses and his books, the way he laughed when something actually struck him as funny rather than when he thought it would create an effect. She thought about his hands, which were a working man's hands, calloused and capable, and which had never once in 3 days reached toward her without being clearly invited. She was not a woman who made mistakes about men, mostly because she had trained herself not to. She had seen enough of the women around her in St. Louis, on the road, in this town, to understand what it cost to make a mistake about a man in 1874, and she had no interest in that cost. But Frederick Covington, considered carefully and with full attention, felt less like a mistake and more like the answer to a question she had not quite finished asking. He came into Casper on a Wednesday in late November, as promised, and she was teaching when he rode past the school window. She registered the bay horse and the canvas duster and kept teaching, because 23 children deserved their full arithmetic lesson, but she found that the remaining half hour of the school day moved with a certain frustrating slowness. She was at Harlan's feed and supply by 4:15 in the afternoon. He was, as promised, arguing with the price of oats. "Callahan," said the man behind the counter, Harlan's son, a round-faced young man named Pete with the look of someone who has just watched something click into place. "Do you know Mr. Covington here?" "I do," she said, and Frederick turned from the counter and his face did the thing she had been thinking about for 3 weeks, that full, real smile, and she felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the wood stove behind the counter. "Miss Callahan," he said, "you look well." "I am well," she said. "The school is good. The children are remarkable, and the oat prices here are genuinely egregious. I agree with you." Frederick laughed, and Pete looked between them with frank curiosity, and it occurred to Henrietta that this was what happiness felt like when it was still new enough to be surprising. They had supper at the town's one reasonable eating establishment, a place called Reeves that served beef stew and cornbread and coffee in thick white mugs, and they talked for 3 hours without running out of things to say. Frederick told her about the ranch in November, the horses settled in for winter, Eli having developed a strong opinion about the best way to stack firewood, and having stated this opinion at considerable length. He told her about a morning 2 weeks ago when he had ridden up to the high ground and seen the mountains with fresh snow all the way down their sides, and how he had stood there looking at it and thought about the road to Casper and about her, which he told her with a straight face and no apparent anxiety about having said it. "You thought about me on the mountain," she said. "I thought about what you said," he clarified, though she did not think this clarification was entirely truthful, about wanting to see the ranch. "I thought that the mountains looked especially worth seeing and that I would like to show someone." "You could show Eli," she said. "Eli has seen mountains," he said. "He is not appreciably impressed," she smiled. "I would like to see the mountains," she said, meeting his eyes directly, "and the ranch, and whatever else you think is worth seeing." Frederick looked at her for a long moment, with the steady, serious attention that she had come to understand was simply the way he looked at things that mattered to him. And then he said, "Henrietta, I am not a man who is good at indirect communication, so I will say directly that I think about you considerably more than the oat prices in this town, and that what I would most like in the world is to know you better and longer, and that if that is an imposition I apologize for it, but there it is." The restaurant was loud around them, rough men eating their suppers, a woman at the next table nursing a baby, the stove crackling, the wind making itself known against the windows. In the middle of all of it, Henrietta Callahan looked at Frederick Covington and felt the last of her wariness not collapse but transform, become something that was not defense, but simply knowledge of what she wanted and recognition of what was being offered and clear sight of the difference between this and every other thing she had been offered or subjected to in her 22 years. "It is not an imposition," she said. He came to Casper again in December twice, which was not his standard twice-yearly schedule, and nobody believed for a moment that the oats required that much attention. Mrs. Patterson, who had sharp eyes and a soft heart, set a third place at Sunday dinner the second time he was in town, and did not comment on it except to observe that Frederick Covington had excellent table manners and ate everything on his plate, which were her highest forms of compliment. He brought her a book. This was on his second December visit, and he produced it from his saddlebag with the careful air of a man who has thought a great deal about a small gesture, and is trying not to let it show. It was a copy of Washington Irving's The Sketchbook, a little worn at the spine with someone's faint pencil notes in the margins in places. "It was my mother's," he said. "She marked the passages she liked. I thought you might enjoy it." Henrietta held it carefully. "Frederick," she said, "You don't have to read it," he said quickly. "It's just I will read every word," she said, including the pencil notes. She looked at him. "You brought me your mother's book." "She has another copy," he said, somewhat less convincingly than he perhaps intended. "Does she?" A pause. "No," he said, "but she would have wanted someone to appreciate it properly, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you were that someone." She stepped forward then, a small step, not large but deliberate, and kissed him on the cheek with a brief, warm, completely intentional press of her lips, and felt him go absolutely still, and then she stepped back and said, "Thank you," and opened the book to the first page. He stood in Mrs. Patterson's hallway looking at the place on his cheek, where she had kissed him, with an expression of a man who has just been shown something that rearranges the furniture of his whole internal world. Mrs. Patterson, appearing from the kitchen with impeccable timing, said, "I'll put coffee on," and disappeared again with the satisfied air of a woman who has orchestrated nothing and is pleased about it. Christmas came to Casper with a good snowfall and a community gathering at the church hall that the whole town attended, because the winter was long and any excuse for warmth and company was embraced with genuine enthusiasm. Frederick was in town for it, ostensibly because one of his horses had developed a lameness that he wanted the town's one passable veterinarian to look at, which was plausible enough. And he walked beside Henrietta to the church hall through the snow, and she put her hand in the crook of his arm, the first time she had done so, and felt his arm close slightly to accommodate it, as if she had always been there. Inside, the hall was strung with pine boughs and lit with what seemed like every candle in the territory, and there was fiddle music and dancing and children running with a freedom permitted by the season, and the food that the women had brought was the kind of communal, generous, imperfect cooking that means home. Henrietta was introduced to people she had met only in passing as the schoolteacher, and was welcomed with the frank warmth of a town that had needed a good teacher and knew it. Several of the parents of her students found her specifically to tell her what their children had said about school in the last 2 months, and Henrietta received this with a happiness that was entirely genuine and entirely mixed up with the fact of Frederick standing 2 feet away with his hand at the small of her back, not directing or guiding, just present. At some point in the evening he asked her to dance. The fiddle was playing a reel, and she had not danced in 2 years, and he was, she discovered immediately, a better dancer than she would have guessed based on any other evidence. Not showy, but steady and sure-footed, with a sense of rhythm that felt innate rather than learned. "Where did you learn to dance?" she said, turning under his hand. "Indiana," he said. "My mother insisted. She said that a man who could not dance was only half-educated." "She sounds like a woman I would very much like to meet," Henrietta said. "She would like you," he said, "enormously. She would also immediately begin asking pointed questions about your intentions, and I apologize in advance for that." "I would not mind," she said, and she meant it in more than one direction. He looked at her, and the fiddle moved into a slower melody, and the dancing around them changed, and they did not stop moving but moved differently, and she was looking up at him and he was looking down at her, and in the warm, bright, crowded church hall of Casper, Wyoming Territory, in the winter of 1874, something between them became unmistakable. "Henrietta," he said quietly against the music. "I know," she said. He pulled her very gently, very slightly closer, and she went willingly, and they danced. January of 1875 was brutal, as January in Wyoming Territory had a right to be, but Henrietta found that it did not trouble her the way cold had always troubled her before. There was something sustaining about having a purpose, the school, the children, the daily satisfying work of minds opening to things they did not know, and something additionally sustaining about the particular warmth that comes from knowing someone is thinking about you 40 miles away in a house on a creek. Frederick's letters began arriving in January. He was not, he had warned her, a practiced letter writer, and the first letter bore this out in its careful, unadorned sentences. But she read it 6 times, which told her everything she needed to know about the value of practiced prose versus honest content. He wrote about the ranch and the weather and Eli's evolving theory about proper kindling arrangement. He wrote about a mare he was nursing through a difficult winter who had made a full recovery and whose personality he described in terms of such affectionate precision that Henrietta found herself laughing alone at the kitchen table at Mrs. Patterson's. And at the end of the letter, after the news and the weather and the mare, he wrote, "I think about our conversations on the road from the trading post often, and I am glad beyond my ability to express it in this letter that you were heading north when I was." She wrote back at length, because she was a better writer than she was many other things, and because she had things to tell him about Tommy Griffith's mathematical discoveries, about Amos and Clara and the quiet dignity with which they navigated a school that sometimes treated them as guests rather than students, about Vera reading her first full paragraph aloud to the class, and the expression on the other children's faces, which had made Henrietta have to look out the window for a moment to collect herself. She wrote about Mrs. Patterson's cat, Admiral, who had recently developed the ability to open the pantry door, and was using this skill with concerning strategic ambition. She wrote about the town, its politics and personalities, the way the world was changing around it and the ways it resisted change and the ways it was being changed regardless. And at the end she wrote, "I have read your mother's book through twice, all the marked passages and all the ones she did not mark. I think her taste was excellent and I think yours is too, for recognizing that I would want it." He came into town in February and March and April, and each time there was more ease between them and more depth, and the thing between them grew in the particular way that things grow when they are real, not in sudden dramatic gestures, but in the accumulated weight of knowing someone fully and being known. In April, he asked her to come see the ranch. He asked carefully, framing it correctly, with the same precise honesty that was characteristic of him. He said he would ride to town on a Saturday, and she could come back with him and see the place, and he would have her back in Casper by Sunday evening. He said he had spoken to Eli, who had apparently noted that the place could stand some consideration of what it looked like from a visitor's perspective, and had spent 3 days straightening and sweeping things that had not been straightened or swept in some time. He said that the mountains were at their best in spring. She said yes before he finished the sentence. The road northwest from Casper in the middle of April was a revelation. The land had come back from winter with the particular extravagance of northern grassland spring, everything green and gold, and shot through with wildflowers she didn't have names for, the creek running high and bright in its banks, the mountains standing clear and enormous against a sky of such blue that it seemed almost excessive. She rode beside him on a calm sorrel mare he had brought for her, not double on Garrison, as they had managed that first difficult road, but their own separate horses, and they talked and were sometimes quiet, and the quiet was a comfortable thing that fit naturally between them. The ranch was not large, but it was well made and well kept in the way of a man who builds things to last rather than for show. The house was timber and plaster, 1 story, with a good chimney and a porch that faced east toward the mountains. The barn was solid. The corral held 7 horses who came to the fence with the frank curiosity of animals who are handled regularly and like people. A kitchen garden behind the house had been turned and was waiting for planting. And there was Eli, who turned out to be a small, wire-thin man with white hair and the brownest, most permanently weathered face Henrietta had ever seen, approximately 70 years old and absolutely furious about it. He looked at her with sharp black eyes and said without preamble, "You the school teacher." "I am," she said. "Frederick been distracted since October," Eli said. "Good to have a face to put to it." "Eli," Frederick said. "I'm going to feed the horses," Eli said, and went with the air of a man who has delivered his verdict and considers the matter settled. Henrietta looked at Frederick, who had developed a slight color in his face that she found entirely appealing. "He likes you," Frederick said. That is essentially a passionate declaration from Eli. The ranch in spring was everything Frederick had described in his letters and more, and she spent 2 days walking it with him. The creek and the high ground and the pastures where the mares were, the barn with its smell of hay and horses, the porch in the evenings where they sat while the light went off the mountains in stages, first the peaks going orange and then pink, and then the soft blue-gray of dusk. She helped him turn the kitchen garden and found a satisfaction in it she hadn't expected, her hands in the soil in the spring afternoon, with the mountains watching over everything. She sat in the kitchen and drank coffee with Eli, who told her stories about Frederick's early years at the ranch with a combination of affectionate mockery and genuine pride that made her understand more about both of them. On the second evening, sitting on the porch watching the mountains go dark, Frederick said, "What do you think of it?" "I think it's one of the most beautiful places I have ever been," she said. "I built it slowly," he said. "Over 4 years. I always thought," he paused. He was holding his coffee mug in both hands, looking at the mountains, and there was something in the line of his jaw that she recognized as a man who is figuring out how to say the exact right true thing. "I always thought it was missing something. Not in any way I could name. Just I'd stand on this porch in the evenings, and there would be this sense of something not yet completed." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the evening was all around them, and the mountains were enormous and still. "Henrietta," he said, and set down his coffee, and turned toward her on the bench, and took her hands in both of his, which she permitted absolutely. "I know that you came to Wyoming for a teaching position, and I know that you are a woman with her own direction and her own purposes, and I would not in any world ask you to give those up. What I want to ask is whether those purposes might include me, whether you might consider whether it would be something you could want to build this with me. Not in place of what you want, alongside it." He looked at her with the full, direct, unguarded look that she had first seen in a cold trading post and that she had not stopped thinking about since. "Henrietta Callahan, I am asking you to marry me if you would have me, and I am asking it as plainly as I can because you have always deserved plain truth. The mountains in the dusk, the horses moving in the corral, the sound of the creek, Eli somewhere inside doing something that involved a wooden spoon and considerable noise." Henrietta looked at the man who had walked into a room of people choosing silence and had spoken up, who had given her back 3 days of his schedule because she was heading the same direction, who had argued for her humanity to a room and then had not used that argument as currency, who had written letters about a mare and kindling and had put at the end of them things that were true and unadorned, who was holding her hands in both of his and asking her the question with his whole face open, nothing held back. "Yes," she said. "Frederick, yes. Obviously, yes." He looked at her for a moment as if he needed to make sure he had heard correctly, and then his face did the full, transforming thing and he pulled her toward him and she went. And they held each other on the porch of the house he had built slowly, in the Wyoming dusk, with the mountains going dark and all the world going quiet around them. Eli knocked on the inside of the window frame 3 seconds later and said, without looking out, "I'll make more coffee." They were married in June of 1875 in the Casper Church, which was small and plain and perfect for the purpose. Mrs. Patterson wore her best dress and wept in the thoroughly delighted way of a woman who considers herself to have had a hand in events, which was not entirely inaccurate. Eli came to town for the occasion and wore a suit that appeared to have been stored since approximately 1855, and that he wore with complete dignity. Hopkins from the Territorial School office attended and seemed to be considering revising his general opinion of the world. The children from the school were not officially invited, but arranged themselves outside the church windows with the confidence of people who feel entitled to witness things, and Tommy Griffith could be heard clearly from inside arguing about the best viewing angle. Henrietta wore a dress of blue wool that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew over 3 weeks of evenings, simple and well-made, the kind of dress that would serve for many purposes and did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers that one of her students, Clara, the Shoshone girl, had brought her that morning, tied with a piece of red ribbon, and they were more beautiful than any flowers she could have found in a shop. Frederick stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, which were clean and pressed, and which he wore with the slightly formal air of a man slightly outside his natural element. And when she came through the door and he saw her, the formal air dropped away entirely, and he looked at her with such uncomplicated happiness that the minister, a practical man not given to sentiment, paused in his preliminaries and cleared his throat. The ceremony was brief and without theater, the words old and true, and when they were said Henrietta found that she felt them in her chest, the actual weight of the promise, the actual solidity of the thing she was choosing, and she held Frederick's hands and looked at him and said I will with the same directness she brought to everything, and he said I will with an answering steadiness, and the room was full of people who were genuinely glad. They rode back to the ranch that afternoon, which was by now a road she knew, the cottonwoods and the creek and the rolling land and the mountains getting larger. She rode beside him on the sorrel mare he now simply thought of as hers, which perhaps he always had, and the long June light lay gold and warm on everything. And she thought about the road to the trading post in October, and the woman she had been on that road, angry and alone and calculating the angles of a very bad situation. And she thought about this road now, and the distance between them. And the way that distance had been covered not by luck or rescue but by the particular combination of her own will and this man's simple, uncalculating decency. "What are you thinking?" Frederick asked. "About roads," she said, "and where they lead." "Did they lead somewhere satisfactory?" he asked. She looked at the mountains ahead of them, brilliant in the late sun, enormous and entirely themselves. "Extraordinarily," she said. Eli had made dinner and left it on the stove and gone discreetly to his own small cabin on the property with what he described as considerable things to do, which everyone understood to mean that he was giving them their evening. The house was warm and smelled of the food he had made, beef and potatoes, and something sweetened with wild plum, that turned out to be the most improbable pie she had ever eaten. And they ate it at the kitchen table by lamplight and talked and laughed, and it was entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary. The summer that followed was one of the best of Henrietta's life. She rode back to Casper 3 days a week to teach summer students, the children whose parents wanted them to continue their studies through the season, and the other days she was at the ranch, where she had established a small kitchen garden of her own that she tended with the same organized passion she brought to the school. She had planted it with seeds sent from St. Louis through the post, a task she had organized the previous spring, and by July it was producing more than the 3 of them could reasonably eat, which meant that Eli had developed strong opinions about the freezing and preserving of vegetables, opinions which he expressed at considerable and authoritative length. She wrote to her friend Margaret in St. Louis and received back a letter of such enthusiastic and detailed happiness for her that she read it to Frederick at the kitchen table, and he listened with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands and said, when she finished, "She sounds like someone who loves you very much." "She does," Henrietta said. "I should like her to meet you someday. I think I would be somewhat terrified," he said, "but yes." He was a man who showed his love in the way that some people express their convictions, not in declarations but in the constant, unvarying practice of it. He brought her coffee in the mornings before she had to ask. When she came home tired from a difficult week at the school, he asked what had been hard about it and then listened to the full answer rather than the summary. He built her a proper desk for the bedroom corner she had claimed for her own writing and studying, with a shelf above it for her books, including Washington Irving with the pencil marks, which she had placed at eye level. He told her, regularly and without particular ceremony, that he loved her, and the way he said it, without performance, the way you state a fact you consider important, meant that she believed it every single time. She told him she loved him the first time on a July evening when they were sitting on the porch watching a thunderstorm build over the mountains, that slow, magnificent assembly of clouds that the Wyoming sky put on in summer. The light was going green gold the way it does before a storm, and the horses in the corral were restless, and the air smelled of rain not yet arrived, and she was leaning against his shoulder and she said into the charged air, "I love you, Frederick. I want you to know that." He turned and kissed her, slow and thorough, and with the full, serious attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, and then he said, against her hair, "You are the best thing that has come to me in all my years in this territory, Henrietta, and I love you beyond what I am able to properly say." "You say it well enough," she said. The storm arrived and drove them inside, and they closed the shutters against the rain, and sat by the stove in the warm house with the storm outside, and everything inside as good as she had ever known anything to be. In August of 1875, Henrietta went to see Dr. Perkins in Casper, who was a capable, practical physician with the weathered air of a man who had seen the full range of what the frontier produced in the way of human experience. She came out of his office and stood in the August sun with her hand over her stomach and the particular quality of knowledge that changes everything, and she thought about how she was going to tell Frederick, and decided she was going to tell him exactly as it was, plainly, directly, with all of it said. She told him that evening on the porch, the same porch where he had asked her to marry him, which felt like the right place for things of this nature to be said. She said she was expecting a child, and she said it clearly, and watched his face go through 3 or 4 things in quick succession: surprise, something that might have been fear, and then a wave of happiness so complete and uncomplicated that it erased everything preceding it. He stood up and lifted her off the bench and held her, and she held him back, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, which was the right response to something this large. When he finally spoke, he said, very quietly against her hair, "This is Henrietta. This is the most important thing that has ever happened." "Yes," she said, "I think so too." "Are you well?" He pulled back to look at her face. "Are you all right?" "I am excellent," she said. "The doctor says I am healthy and sensible, which I believe are his 2 highest ratings." He laughed, and then he was solemn again, and he put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with the full, undivided attention that she loved about him and said, "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said, and kissed him. Eli was told the next morning, over breakfast, and sat for a long moment with his coffee, and then said, without looking up, "Decent," which was understood by both of them to mean approximately everything. Henrietta continued teaching through the fall, which caused some comment from several members of the school board and considerably less comment from the parents of her students, who by this point had strong opinions about the quality of their children's education and were not interested in interrupting it. She was direct with Hopkins when he raised the subject, noting that her capacity to teach was unaffected by her condition and that she intended to continue until such time as it was genuinely impractical. And Hopkins, who was a sensible man at core, agreed with a speed that suggested he had not particularly wanted to have the conversation in the first place. In February of 1876, on a night when the wind was doing extraordinary things to the Wyoming landscape, and Eli had ridden to a neighboring ranch to get the doctor with a determination and speed that belied his 70 years, Henrietta and Frederick's son was born in the bedroom of the house on the creek, with the mountains outside and the storm above, and the horses shifting in the barn as if they knew something was happening. He was a large, healthy, remarkably opinionated baby from his first moments, which made both of them laugh in the specific, startled way of new parents who were not prepared for the degree to which a newborn can have a personality. They named him James, after Frederick's father, a man who had died before Frederick left Indiana and who Frederick described as the most honest person he had ever known, which was a high standard for a name to carry. James Covington proceeded to carry it magnificently, as it turned out, but that was a longer story. The doctor, having arrived in the storm and done his part and declared both mother and child healthy, was given coffee and dried plum pie by Eli, who had apparently made it in anticipation of the occasion, and he sat in the kitchen with the air of a man restored by domestic warmth. And Eli sat across from him, and they talked about the storm and the territory and things that had nothing to do with the particular miracle that had just occurred in the next room. In the bedroom, Frederick sat on the edge of the bed with his son in his arms, who was asleep with the total unconscious confidence of new life, and Henrietta was looking at the two of them with a tiredness that was the best kind of tiredness she had ever felt, the tiredness of something completed and real. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your forehead," Frederick said, "which means he will be thinking things I cannot anticipate for the rest of my life." She laughed softly, so as not to wake the baby. "I think that is fair," she said. He looked at her over the top of James's sleeping head. "I keep thinking about the trading post," he said quietly. "I keep thinking about how close it came to going entirely differently." "It didn't," she said, "but it almost did. Most things that matter almost went differently," she said. "That's what makes them matter." She reached out and touched the back of his hand, and his fingers closed around hers. "You were there, Frederick, and so was I, and here we are." He looked at her for a long moment, with the full, honest face she had learned to read the way she read the sky out here, entirely and with complete attention. "Here we are," he said. James made a small sound in his sleep, a sound of unqualified contentment, and the stove ticked, and the storm was easing outside, and the mountains were out there in the dark waiting for morning, as they always were, enormous and reliable and fully themselves. The spring of 1876 brought more changes to the territory. The post was growing, the railroad was moving, the world that had seemed so raw and uncertain when Henrietta had ridden that rutted road from the trading post was acquiring edges and addresses and the particular weight of permanent settlement. Casper was becoming more of a town and less of a collection of intentions. The school was given a second room, and Henrietta hired an assistant teacher, a young woman named Ruth Fowler from Ohio, who was 20 years old and serious about her work, and who Henrietta liked immediately for the same reasons she liked all people who were serious about their work. She wrote to Margaret in St. Louis and told her about James, and Margaret's responding letter arrived in May with so many exclamation marks that Henrietta read it to Frederick at dinner, and he said, "Is she always this enthusiastic?" And Henrietta said, "She has been like this about everything good for as long as I have known her," and Frederick said, "The world needs more people like that," which she thought was exactly right. Eli, who had appointed himself James's secondary guardian, with the same combination of authority and fondness that characterized all his relationships, could be found on any given afternoon with the baby in the sling arrangement he had constructed from canvas and leather, going about his ranch tasks with the baby asleep against his chest, and the expression of a man who has found a satisfactory solution to a practical problem. Frederick had a photograph taken in Casper of the three of them: Eli, himself, James, which Henrietta kept on the desk in the bedroom corner, next to Washington Irving. She also sent for that second copy of Washington Irving for Eli, having found it through a bookseller in Cheyenne, and gave it to him one evening after dinner. Eli looked at it for a long time and then said, without any particular expression, "Good book," and put it carefully on his side of the shelf in the main room and never spoke of it again. The next time she looked it had pencil marks in it. The summer of 1876 was full and warm and busy, in the way that summers are when your life has the texture of something actually lived. James grew with the particular enthusiasm of healthy babies, acquiring opinions about every subject at a rate that seemed to exceed what was strictly necessary. The ranch was doing well. Frederick had sold horses to 2 cavalry posts that spring, and was in the process of building a reputation for quality animals that was beginning to reach beyond the immediate county. Henrietta was teaching 5 days a week and had begun organizing an evening class for adults, women mostly, who had come to the territory with their families and had never had much schooling, and who turned out to be some of the most motivated students she had ever taught. She also, in the fall of 1876, received a letter from Cecil Drummond. It came through the county sheriff's office in Laramie, forwarded to Casper at her name, and it was brief and ugly and made her hands tighten when she read it. A letter that was part threat and part grievance, the letter of a man who had been sitting somewhere with his bitterness and had decided she was the cause of it. He knew where she was. He implied he had not forgotten what he considered his loss. She showed it to Frederick. He read it twice, his face completely neutral, which she had learned was not the absence of feeling but the management of it. Then he handed it back to her. "We should take this to Sheriff Caldwell," he said. "Today." "Yes," she said, "and we should write down everything that happened at the trading post with dates and names and have it witnessed." "Yes," she said again. "I already know the names of 3 witnesses." They rode to Casper together that afternoon, which was a Wednesday when she would not ordinarily have gone, and they sat in Sheriff Caldwell's office, and Henrietta told the story of the trading post in the same direct, factual, complete terms she brought to everything. And Sheriff Caldwell, a large, plain-spoken man who had come up in Texas before Wyoming, wrote it all down in his ledger with his large, slow, careful handwriting and said, when she was finished, "Drummond's been known to this office before. He ran a similar operation in Nebraska Territory 2 years ago. I'll write to the Laramie sheriff and I'll put the word out." He looked at her steadily. "You did right coming here. And I'd say you've been doing right since October of last year, which is more than most people manage." Drummond never came to Casper. The sheriff's word going out was apparently sufficient mathematics to persuade him of the risk, and by December they had word through Caldwell's office that he had moved south into Colorado and then seemed to have kept moving. Henrietta filed this information in the part of her mind that understood the world accurately without letting it govern the day, and went back to teaching and the ranch and the particular rich texture of her actual life. In the spring of 1877, she was expecting again. This was discovered with somewhat less surprise and considerably more practical preparedness than James had been, and Henrietta organized accordingly. She trained Ruth Fowler to run the school in her full absence for a period, organized the vegetable garden to need less daily attention, and wrote to Margaret with the news, receiving back a letter of such comprehensive happiness that Admiral the Cat, who had come out to Wyoming in a remarkable feat of logistics and was now Eli's primary critic, walked across it and left paw prints. The second baby was a girl, born in November of 1877, with a set of opinions about the world that she announced immediately and at volume, and which set the tone for her entire subsequent life. They named her Frances, after Henrietta's mother, a woman she barely remembered, but thought about with a consistency that the years had not diminished. Frances had Frederick's steady dark eyes and something in the set of her chin that was entirely Henrietta, and James, who was nearly 2, regarded her for a long moment after his first introduction, and then offered her a small wooden horse, which she immediately and forcefully rejected, which seemed to satisfy him. "She's going to be difficult," Eli said from the doorway with manifest approval. "She is going to be herself," Henrietta said, which she had already decided was the best thing she could offer any of her children. Frederick held Frances in the same way he had held James, with the full, serious attention of a man for whom the weight of the thing was entirely clear, and looked at Henrietta over the baby's head with an expression that she had catalogued entirely and which she never took for granted, which was the expression of a man who knows exactly what he has and understands what it is worth. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like myself," she said. "Tired and entirely myself." "That," he said, "is the best possible answer." The years that followed built on themselves in the way that good years do, each one leaving something solid that the next one could stand on. Frederick's horse operation grew to be one of the most respected small ranches in the county, and the Covington name became associated with quality animals in the territory's cavalry, and ranch community in a way that brought fair prices and straightforward dealings. Henrietta taught until 1879, when the Casper School Board offered her the position of head of the county's territorial school system, an administrative role that she accepted with the understanding that she would continue to teach herself as part of it. She had no interest in becoming entirely administrative, because the actual teaching was the thing that mattered, and she knew enough about herself to know that a separation from it would leave a gap that paperwork would not fill. The school had 3 rooms by 1879, and Ruth Fowler had become an excellent teacher in her own right, and Amos and Clara, the Shoshone students, had both continued their education with a tenacity that Henrietta found profoundly moving, Clara going on to a secondary education in Cheyenne through a program that Henrietta had spent 2 years advocating for. The day she received Clara's letter saying she had passed her examinations, she put it in the desk drawer beside Washington Irving's sketchbook and the letter from Margaret that had paw prints on it, because some things you keep in the same place. James grew into a boy who was, as Frederick had predicted, thinking things that neither of them could entirely anticipate, with a mathematical mind like Tommy Griffith's, and a love of horses that was simply a given, genetics and environment conspiring in perfect alignment. Francis grew into exactly what Eli had predicted, and what Henrietta had intended entirely herself, with a ferocity of personality and a warmth underneath it that made the combination rather magnificent. She became the ranch's self-appointed diplomatic contact with the horses, whom she treated as intellectual equals, and who responded to her with a respect that the more experienced horsemen on the property found both inexplicable and indisputable. In the autumn of 1880, Henrietta and Frederick Covington sat on their porch, the one he had built facing east toward the mountains, the one where he had asked her and she had said yes, the one where she had told him about James, the one where they had sat through 6 years of storms and clear nights and everything between, and watched the sun go off the peaks in its evening way, first orange, then pink, then the darkening blue. James was inside doing mathematics with a lantern and a piece of chalk on a board Frederick had made him for exactly this purpose. Francis was in the barn, presumably negotiating with the horses about something, which was her evening routine. Eli was in his cabin, which had a new bookshelf added the previous spring that was now fully stocked with a variety of volumes that he had never been observed purchasing, but which appeared with regularity, and through the window of which a lamplight burned with the particular quality of someone entirely absorbed in what they were reading. The mountains were enormous and unhurried and entirely themselves. "Do you remember," Henrietta said, "that morning at the trading post, the rope?" "I remember," Frederick said. "I had almost gotten out of it on my own," she said. "I was so close." "I know," he said. "You have told me this several times." "It is important to me that you know it," she said, "that I was not waiting, that I was working at it." He turned to look at her. "I have never for one moment thought otherwise," he said. "You were working at the rope and you would have gotten out of it. I simply removed one person from the equation." "You did considerably more than that," she said. "Perhaps," he said. "But the important part was you walking out of that door. I just held it open." She considered this for a moment, and then she leaned her head on his shoulder, which was where it had taken to resting in the way that all things find their proper place eventually, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the mountains go from pink to the deep final blue of evening. "Frederick," she said. "Henrietta," he said, "I am very glad you were in that trading post." "I am very glad you needed oats," he said. She laughed, and the mountains went dark and the lamplight came on in the house behind them, James's lantern and Francis's lamp from the barn, and Eli's light steady in his window, and the stars above Wyoming absolutely extraordinary in their number, the way they always were out here where there was nothing between you and them. "Come inside," she said. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," he said. She looked at his face. He was looking at the last of the light on the highest peaks, the faint persistence of it against the darkening sky, with an expression she knew completely, the expression of a man who knows what he has and takes nothing for granted, who looks at the world around him with the same honesty he brings to everything. "Frederick," she said. "I was just thinking," he said. "What?" He looked at her, and the porch was dark, and the stars were coming out above the mountains, and James's lamp burned inside, and the horses were settling in the barn, and Eli's light was on, and the creek was running cold and clear below the house, and the world that they had made together was all around them, solid and real and entirely theirs. "I was thinking," he said, "that I am the luckiest man in this territory, and I knew it from the moment I walked through that door." "You walked through it to get harness rings," she reminded him. "I walked through it," he said, "because I had been watching your wagon through the window for 5 minutes, and I was trying to decide what to do, and then Drummond had you through the door before I could stop it." He paused. "I should have come out sooner. I've thought about that." "You came when it mattered," she said. "You had already freed yourself," he said. "You always free yourself, Henrietta. That is what I love about you. That has always been what I love about you." She looked at him for a long moment, this steady, plain-spoken, completely honest man who had held a door open, and then offered her his direction, and then given her everything he had, and was with the same uncalculating straightforwardness with which he had done the first thing. And she felt the truth of 6 years between them, all the days and seasons and conversations and nights, all the roads and the ranch and the school and the children, and the books with pencil marks in them. All of it present and accounted for, all of it real. "Come inside," she said again, and took his hand and pulled, and he came, and the door closed behind them against the October cold, and the light was warm inside the house, and James said, from his corner with his chalk and his board, "Papa, come look at this." And Frederick went, still holding her hand, pulling her with him, and she let herself be pulled toward the lamplight and the numbers and the 2 children who were theirs, and the house was full of everything that made a life worth the living of it. And outside, the mountains stood in the dark as they always did, faithful and enormous and absolutely themselves, and the creek ran cold and clear, and the stars were more than you could count, and Henrietta Callahan Covington stood in the middle of her own life and knew, with every part of herself, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.